Hemi or LS? Which V8 swap is right for you? In this video, we're going to discuss the pros and cons of each one. Hey everybody, it's Bo with X's Jeeps, and we custom build badass Jeeps. Well, part of that custom Jeep building badass stuff is putting V8s in Jeep JK Wranglers, something that we're known for doing. And we get asked this question a lot, whether it's through phone call, email, smoke signals, whatever, you name it. I get asked that question all the time.
How much does an LS engine swap cost?
You have to ask, big man. You can't afford it.
There's more than just LS engine swaps available. Obviously, most of you know that the Hemi swap is an option too. It turns out this week we have a really badass 6.2 LS swap build in the shop and a 6.4 Hemi swap in the shop as well. So we're going to go over some of the differences between the two, pros and cons. I'll note that these Jeeps are pretty similarly, they're pretty close to each other as far as builds go. Both running coilovers and long arm kits. They're pretty evenly matched. It's a great way to compare two different builds. Without any further ado, let's start with the LS swap. In this particular Jeep, we're running a 6.2 liter LS engine in the L9H variation. Now, what does the L9H mean? That's pretty much the style of the LS, the way it was built and put together according to the platform that it was going in. In this case, the L9H came in the Yukon Denali. It has variable valve timing, but it did not have the cylinder deactivation in it, which is pretty important, and I'll get back to that in a minute. But there's a ton of different designations for the LS platform. Most of you are familiar with the LS3, which came in the Chevy Corvette. The difference between that engine and this one, there isn't a whole lot actually. Maybe the cam, the front cover, that engine didn't have variable valve timing or DOD in it at all. It was a pretty simple engine. Also, most notably is the intake. You'll see on this engine, it sits up pretty tall. That's because it's a truck intake. You want a lot of air getting in there for all that torque it's trying to produce. In the LS3, the intake sits a lot lower, providing a lot more clearance. And believe it or not, it looks a lot cleaner on the installation than this particular engine. We like this engine because the intake is big, it lets a lot of air in, produces a lot of torque down low where we want it, and it's easy to cam swap. Because it doesn't have the cylinder deactivation in it, the lifters are the same as they would be in like the LS3. So really, to cam swap it, I can literally do that in the frame. All I have to do is pull the valve covers, change out the springs, make sure all the valves are sitting up. I can slide that cam out, slide the new one in, and put it back together. And voila.
Voila.
Why don't you go eat some tartars, you snail-sucking mime lovers?
J'ai rien compris, mais y'a pas de raison de t'exciter de même, toi. C'est cool.
We've added a ton more horsepower and torque to this engine with basically what amounts to maybe $1,500–1,600 in parts. All of that stuff has to be taken into account for because we're doing the VVT delete and we're changing out springs. You get the idea. We can add a ton of horsepower to the LS with just a few bucks. This particular one, we did an LS9 cam in it. That is a very awesome cam. It's pretty cheap. It's GM Performance cam. They're like $130, but they produce a ton of power. It really opens up this engine and lets it breathe. When we dyno tested this, we calculated that we're seeing about 500 horsepower, 510 foot-pounds of torque at the flywheel. We account for about a 30% loss with builds this big. Between the automatic transmission, the 40-inch tires on them, they really suck out the power. But it's still a ton of power over stock. So they're really popular, really fun. They turn a lot of heads. The upside to doing this engine is that it's an aluminum block, unlike the Hemi. We'll get back to that in a minute. It runs a Camaro fan. Pretty cool that we're able to run the Camaro fans on these now because we used to run the Pentastar fan, which was a good fan. It still is. But with the Camaro fan, we're actually able to go into the GM computer and adjust the fan tables accordingly so that we can really keep this engine cool, dial it in exactly where we want it. That's why I love the swap so much. That's all the pros to this system, really. I will add one more thing. When we do an LS engine swap, we don't mate it to the factory transmission like some swap guys do. We actually use a GM 6L80E transmission. That's a tremendous improvement over the NAG one or the 5-speed automatic that was in there before. It really allows this engine to stay in its power band, and a big reason why they moved to the 8 and 10 speeds in the later models. Being able to keep the engine in its power band longer is really important to the efficiency of the motor. In this case, the 6-speed really lets this thing produce a lot of power almost all the time. The downside to this is that we're running a GM engine and electronics inside a Chrysler platform. The big headache with that is that they're running 2 different CAN bus protocols. Basically, they speak a different language.
¿Cómo es Marcellus Wallace? Contesta.
So we have to run some sort of integration somewhere. And in this case, it's hard wiring right here. This is the GM fuse box. So basically everything that you would find for a GM engine fuse-wise and relay-wise on a GM vehicle is inside this tiny little box right here. Very nicely done. It has a nice bracket. It has a nice case. The guys at Overland Performance designed this. John's a great guy, so if you're really interested in one of these kits, hit him up. You can see there's still a ton of wiring involved. We have to run a wire that kind of interfaces between this right here, the GM computer, which sits right here. This is a factory Jeep computer. So you still have 2 computers in here, one controlling the engine, one controlling the body controls. So we have to have that integration to talk between the 2. And the MOCAN, which is stuck underneath the dash, is where that magic happens. It's sort of the translator between the 2. It takes what the GM is doing, deciphers it, whatever, and plugs it into the dash so that all our controls still work. The steering wheel controls still work for the cruise control. AC still works. The whole dash works. I mean, the speedometer, the tachometer, check engine light, all that stuff's still gonna work. So it's still a pretty good setup. Just can be kind of a headache every now and then when something in here in between these 2 goes wrong, and it occasionally does. The other neat thing about this system is the billet bracketry that we're using on this that was designed by Motec out in Las Vegas. We're running essentially what would be the 3.8 accessory drive. We have a Jeep 3.8 alternator, AC compressor, and power steering pump. Well, actually in this case, we have a PSC power steering pump, but it was for a 3.8 engine. All that stuff, those accessories are gonna bolt right up on here. It's kind of neat that it does that. We really like that system because on, say, a suspension system like the Evo Double Throwdown, something where you have a lot of up travel, this setup provides a lot of clearance for that because the accessories are more on the top than they were on the bottom if we were running like a GM accessory drive. On those systems, the AC compressor is down low on the passenger side. I tried this in my Jeep and we ended up smacking that with an upper control arm out on Rusty Nail, Moab. Shortly after we got back, we converted everything over to the Jeep accessory drive and all our clearance issues went away. That's one neat aspect to this. I can't really say that there's a whole lot of cons to this setup other than we have to do the integration between GM and Chrysler. And that can be a pretty big headache. But because of the small footprint of the LS engine and the aluminum block, it cools really well. It's very easy to keep this engine cool compared to the Hemi. Let's move over to the Hemi now and we'll talk about it. All right, now let's talk about the Hemi. Forewarning, I didn't do this swap. Some other shop did, but they did a really clean job on it. So whoever did it, good work. The other thing, I don't know nearly as much about the Hemi as I do the LS engine platform, which is gonna become evident in a minute when I start talking about this. I'm not gonna have as much to say. What this customer is running is a 6.4 liter Hemi V8. Those are rated at 410 horsepower, 429 foot-pounds of torque in the stock form, which I'm pretty sure this is still stock. It's mated to the 5-speed automatic, the NAG one. Very popular transmission, very good, very dependable. It seems to do very well with this. Now, remember I said that the LS is running in the 6-speed automatic? Well, this one, running the 5-speed, runs a little bit higher RPM. Keep that in mind when you're trying to pick what's important to you. The Hemi is gonna run higher RPM because it's only got those 5 gears in it. To me, that's not a deal killer. This thing sounds amazing. Well, we'll talk about that more in a minute. Let's talk about the pros of it. As you can see, the engine bay is super clean in here. It looks very good. Even though it has a bigger footprint than, say, the LS, it seems to sit in here a lot better than the LS and it looks a lot cleaner. You know, all the wire clutter like you do with the LS. Mostly because we don't have all that integration going on. We don't have those different wiring harnesses that are under the engine bay like we do in the LS. And this, it's gonna plug and play almost like a factory swap. It is a cast iron block. It's heavier than the LS. The big deal killer for the Hemi swaps in the beginning was the heating issues because you're trying to keep this big beast producing a lot of power cool. Remember that, guys, as we produce more power, we're producing more heat. Makes it harder to keep cool in something that doesn't have a whole lot of grill area going on. That, with the Pentastar fan, has become a lot easier to keep cool, and just the technology that's come along, it's a lot more efficient for them to keep this engine cool, and they're doing a lot better job of it. So it's not as big of a deal as it used to be back in the early days of the V8 swaps. Other than that, I really can't say that there's any more cons to it versus the LS. I actually like this swap better now because of how easy it swaps in versus the LS, and the maintenance, because we don't really seem to have the issues with the Hemis like we do the LSs as far as the integration stuff. So I like it better. All right, we close the hood. Now for my favorite part. Let's do a little sound check
And see which one sounds better.
All right, there you go. There's a sound check between the two. Let's talk about the last thing, and that's price. When it comes to the price of these swaps, they're not cheap. You're talking like probably going to be sitting around the $30,000 to $35,000 range. Now the LS swap, I could build these turnkey swap to you for about $30,000. In fact, I don't even really like to do them that much anymore because over years just doing these, the integration stuff has been kind of a headache for me, and I just don't want to deal with it. I constantly have customers calling me back having some sort of weird issue. Not the major, not the big. I don't say it's a deal killer, but it's just something that, hey, if we could do the Hemi swaps for the same price and not have some of the integration headaches that we have with the LS, then I'm going to steer people towards the Hemi. It's one of the big reasons why my wife will let us do the Hemi swap later on, the Gladiator. It's very important to know this because a lot of shops will steer you wrong. So the LS engine can't really be installed technically in anything after 2015. The reason for that is because GM didn't produce a passenger vehicle. Very important that we use that word passenger vehicle with the Gen 4 LS engine in it. Even into 2020, they're still putting the 6-liter L96 Gen 4 engine into trucks, but that's not a passenger vehicle. This is a passenger vehicle. So by emissions guidelines, it has to be like or the same. And that is not the case in anything after 2015. GM started putting in the new Generation 5 small block engines in 2016. For that reason, we can't really legally or ethically sell you that swap. That's where the Hemi comes in. That we can put in the new platforms, the JLs and JT. That's not an issue at all. Basically the same engine that they're putting in everything else in the same year models. So we're good to go there. Same price for the Hemi swap as the LS, somewhere in the $30,000 to $35,000 range. It all really depends on some of the additional things that you incorporate into the build. If you have any more questions on that, be sure to hit me up. For more cool videos on Jeep upgrades, click here.